basically set out sort of a basic structure for how stakeholders and governments and First Nations can work together in this. And it includes 3 basic boxes, which we're going to expand upon afterwards. But the first box on the left here is what we're calling an Integrated Oceans Advisory Committee. So this is a group that's intended to bring together all of the different parties to have an inclusive discussion about what we do with this plan. And to support the work of that advisory committee, there's the planning office. So that's the group that introduced themselves here. We do the technical, the coordinating, the administrative work to host meetings, to write documents, to keep all the moving parts in action. And then there is this governance framework, which includes that relationship through a steering committee between federal agencies and First Nations. It also allows for the federal and provincial government to talk about how they coordinate their work on oceans management. So what comes out of the planning process is going to these different groups in the form of recommendations on their way to that final decision-making authority with the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the basic structure. But what we recognized was that not everybody has the time or the energy or the inclination to be involved on an advisory committee, nor can we have everyone in the central and north coast on an advisory committee. It'd be awfully large and really difficult to find a meeting date that works for everyone. So we need to find other ways to get people involved. And that's what we're proposing with this diagram, is that in addition to an advisory committee, how can we create other opportunities for people to provide input and to stay informed about what's happening. So that Integrated Oceans Advisory Committee is one of those ways, and here's a little bit more about it. The acronym is PNCIMA, and it's described on page 6 of that document. So this is that ongoing advisory structure that brings together different industry groups, different communities, recreational users, environmental groups, governments, First Nations. We know that there's going to need to be a balance between this group being inclusive, but also being of a size that allows it to be effective and allows people to build relationships and work efficiently together. So one of the questions we're going to be asking you is, how do we strike that balance and what does that look like? Examples of what this committee might do are things like helping to identify the goals and the objectives for this plan. What are we trying to achieve? Helping to identify some of the priority issues that we need to address in a plan. So in addition to that advisory committee, which has a role over sort of all of the different pieces of the planning process, we also know that if we are going to identify priority issues, we're probably going to want small groups of people who are going to focus in on a discussion about those specific issues. And so that's why we're allowing for something we're terming working groups. So these would be groups of people that are something like a committee, but they're focused on a very specific topic. And that could be a specific marine activity, or it could be about a specific part of PNCIMA. Maybe it's about the Central Coast. And their responsibilities are really to do things like bring together all of the available information. What do we know about that specific activity or place? And potentially to be developing recommendations about how to address that issue, whether it's a topic or an issue that's particular to a place. So the membership on these groups is going to have to be tailored to the topic that's being addressed. But it's likely, again, to include all of those different parties and probably also, in some cases, to include maybe scientists who have specific expertise or people with local knowledge about that specific topic. So just to help you sort of think about what a working group might do, if you think back in your mind to the diagram that had the map with the wind farm and the fisheries and all the other layers on it, all the other themes on it, it just so happens that in Hecate Strait, where that wind farm is being proposed, and whether it happens or not in the near future or in the more distant future, that remains to be seen. But that wind farm actually sits in the same area that's important for a crab fishery. And that also sits in the same area that's important for ferries crossing between Haida Gwaii and Prince Rupert. So there's potential for conflict there. So what can we do through a working group to find ways that allow those different uses to coexist, or to come to solutions about the potential for those conflicts? Another example, and this gentleman brought it up, is there's the potential for increases in certain kinds of marine traffic on the coast. Well, what are the implications of that? And how might we address those implications? Or where does that fit into the future for these parts of the coast? So you may want to convene a working group to have that discussion. What do we know about those kinds of shipping traffic if we're talking about oil tankers? What are the implications of having them traveling past certain parts of the coast? How do they interact with other values that are important to people on those parts of the coast? So another way that we want to bring input and feedback to this is by taking advantage of advisory processes that already exist. Some of you may be involved on commercial fishery advisory processes or other kinds of planning processes. There's a lot of expertise and a lot of experience in those processes. So we want to find a way to bring that into this planning exercise. So what that might look like is if we're developing recommendations or proposals that address a specific activity or that have relevance to a specific activity, then let's bring that proposal or recommendation out of that advisory structure or that advisory process, invite their input and review, and bring that back into the planning process to be informed by that input. So those three things, the advisory processes, the working groups, and the advisory committee, they're all ways for somewhat small groups of people